The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when the reporter arrived at my office in Omaha. Young man, maybe 28, carrying a leather satchel that looked more expensive than my first car. He had that eager look they all have, the ones who think they've stumbled onto something worth telling. "Mr. Brennan," he said, shaking water from his coat. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the old oak one I'd built myself 40 years prior. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper the way a man's workspace should smell when he's lived long enough to earn the right to his habits. "You said on the phone this was about the silo." "Yes, sir." He pulled out a notebook, flipped it open with the practiced motion of someone who believed in the permanence of the written word. "They say you built it when you were just 19 years old, alone, after the whole town called you a coward. Is that true?" I looked past him out the window where the rain streaked down the glass like tears on a face too tired to wipe them away. 67 years old, and some memories still had the power to make my chest tight. "True enough," I said, "but I wasn't a coward. I was just different than them." The reporter leaned forward, pen poised. "Tell me about it, sir. Tell me about the winter of 1918. I reached for my pipe, packed it slowly, bought myself time. Some stories need the right beginning, and this one had been waiting nearly 50 years to be told properly. "It started," I said, lighting the tobacco and letting the first pull settle in my lungs, "on a July morning so hot the chickens wouldn't leave the shade. The smoke rose between us, and I let myself fall backward through time. The train platform in Lawrence, Kansas was nearly empty when I stepped down onto the warped wooden boards. My Army uniform was wrinkled from the 3-day journey from New York, where they'd processed us out of the service with all the warmth of men checking cattle at auction. Discharged. Honorable. Papers folded in my breast pocket alongside the Purple Heart they'd given me for the shrapnel still lodged near my spine. Other men from my company had families waiting. Wives, mothers, children waving little flags and crying the kind of tears that wash away the stain of war. I had no one. I'd written my father from France, told him I was coming home. He hadn't written back. The walk to the farm took 4 hours in the midday heat. I could have waited for the mail wagon, but after 2 years in the trenches, I'd learned that waiting only made things worse. Better to keep moving, better to face what's coming than to let it creep up on you in the dark. The Brennan family farm sat on 200 acres of good Kansas soil land my father had worked for 30 years. The house was the same white paint-peeling porch sagging on the south end where it always had, but something felt different, empty maybe, like a body with the spirit already gone. My father was standing on that porch when I came up the drive. Thomas Brennan, 50 years old, back straight as a fence post despite 3 decades behind a plow. His face had new lines I didn't remember, deep ones carved by something harder than sun and wind. "You're back," he said, not a greeting, just a statement of fact. "Yes, sir." He looked at my uniform, at the ribbons on my chest, at the way I favored my left leg, where the shrapnel had gone in at Argonne Forest. His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "You fought." "Yes, sir." "You survived." "Most of me." He nodded once, then turned toward the door. "Good. You can take over the farm now. I'm getting too old for it." The words hit me harder than German artillery ever had. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. No welcome home. No thank God you're alive. No questions about France or the war or the friends I'd buried in mud that would be their grave for eternity. Just an assumption. Just a claim on my future, as if the last 2 years had been nothing more than an interruption in his plans for my life. "I don't want to farm," I said. He turned back slowly. His eyes, the same gray as mine, had gone hard as flint. "What did you say?" "I said I don't want to farm. I want to study engineering, build bridges, roads, buildings, real structures, things that last." His face went red, the color starting at his collar and rising like floodwater. "You think farming isn't real? You think the work that fed you for 19 years isn't worthy of a man?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, boy?" He came down the porch steps, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "I raised you alone after your mother died, gave you everything, sent you to school, let you go to that damned war when they called, and now you come back and tell me you're too good for the land." "I never said that." "You don't have to say it. I can see it in your eyes. You think you're better than me now. Think because you wore a uniform and saw some French mud, you don't owe me anything. The anger that had been building in my chest since I stepped off that train finally broke loose. I don't owe you anything, sir. I paid my debt. 3 times over. Once to you raising me, once to this country fighting for it, and once to myself surviving when better men than me died screaming in the dark. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before lightning strikes. My father's voice when he finally spoke was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. If you won't do your duty to this family, then you're not my son. Then I guess I'm not. I turned and walked away, didn't look back. Couldn't, because if I had, I might have seen what I learned years later, too late to matter. I might have seen my father's shoulders shaking, might have seen him grab the porch rail to steady himself, might have seen the tears he'd never let anyone witness. But I didn't look back. I just kept walking the same way I'd walked away from the trenches in France. One foot in front of the other. Survival in motion. Behind me in that house I'd never enter again, Thomas Brennan stood alone. What I didn't know, what he'd never tell me, was that the farm was already lost. The bank had sent notices, 3 of them, bright yellow paper, demanding payment on loans taken out to buy seed after 2 years of failed harvests. He had until October to pay $2,000 he didn't have. He'd needed me. Not wanted, needed. But pride is a poison that kills slowly, and neither of us knew the antidote. I walked to the train station and bought a ticket to Redemption Creek, Nebraska. I'd heard the name from another soldier, a kid from Omaha, who died at Belleau Wood with my name on his lips, asking me to write his mother. The town was small, he'd said. Quiet. The kind of place where a man could disappear if he needed to. Disappearing sounded good to me. The train arrived in Redemption Creek at sunset, painting the prairie in colors that hurt to look at. Gold and red and purple, like the sky was bleeding out after a long day of dying. The town was smaller than I'd imagined. One main street, maybe 20 buildings total, all of them wood and square and proud in that way. Frontier towns are proud, like they're daring the wilderness to try and take them back. I stepped off the train with everything I owned in an army duffel. A few clothes, a blanket, a manual on military field engineering I'd stolen from a supply tent in France, and a Purple Heart I couldn't bring myself to throw away but didn't know what to do with either. The saloon was the biggest building on the main street, 2 stories tall, with a painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. I pushed through the doors into the dim interior where a dozen men were drinking and a tired-looking piano was struggling through a tune that might have been beautiful once. The bartender was a thick man with gray in his beard and eyes that measured strangers the way a butcher measures meat. "Help you." "Looking for work," I said, "and a place to stay." "What kind of work?" "Any kind. Building, hauling, digging. I'm not particular." He looked at my uniform, at the ribbons, at the way I stood with most of my weight on my right leg. "Soldier boy? Huh, war's over. We don't need heroes here." "I'm not a hero, just a man who needs work." A laugh came from the corner, harsh and mocking. A young man, maybe 24, well-dressed for a farming town. Jack Murphy, though I didn't know his name yet. "You hear that, boys? He's not a hero. Just a man who probably ran away the first time the shooting started." The other men laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laughter. The kind men make when they're not sure if they should be laughing, but don't want to be left out. I looked at Jack Murphy, really looked at him. Saw the softness in his hands, the clean fingernails, the way he held himself, like someone who'd never had to fight for anything that mattered. And I saw something else. Guilt. The kind that comes from watching other men go to war while you stay home. "I didn't run," I said quietly, "but you did." His face went white, then red. He stood up, chair scraping. "What did you say? You heard me." He took a step forward, and I could see he wanted to swing, wanted to prove something to himself and everyone watching. But there was something in my eyes that stopped him. Something I'd learned in France in the moments between artillery barrages when you had to decide whether to stay in the trench or go over the top. Something that told him I'd killed men before, and one more wouldn't keep me up at night. "Jack," the voice came from the doorway, calm and authoritative. "Go home." I turned to see a man in his early 40s wearing a sheriff's badge and leaning on a crutch. His left leg was missing from the knee down, the pant leg pinned up neatly. Sheriff Frank Whitmore, though I didn't know his name yet either. Jack Murphy glared at me, then at the sheriff, then pushed past and out into the evening. His father, the bartender, looked like he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. The sheriff gestured toward a table. Buy you a drink. I don't have money. Didn't ask if you had money, asked if I could buy you a drink. We sat and he poured whiskey from a bottle he'd brought with him. Good whiskey, not the rotgut they served at the bar. Belleau Wood, he said, pointing at his missing leg. June of 1918. Uquamam, Argonne Forest, September. He nodded, understanding, passing between us without need for elaboration. We drank in silence for a moment. The town's not friendly to strangers, he finally said, especially the soldiers coming home. They don't understand what we saw, don't want to understand, makes them uncomfortable. I'm not looking for understanding, just work and a place to sleep. Boarding house is full, but there's an old grain silo up on the hill past town. Railroad built it 10 years ago when they thought this place would boom. Never happened. It's been empty since. You could sleep there if you want. Won't be comfortable, but it's shelter. Sounds perfect. He studied me over the rim of his glass. What's your name, soldier? Elias Brennan. People call me Eli. Well, Eli, welcome to Redemption Creek. Try not to let the bastards grind you down. The walk to the silo took me past the last building in town and up a gentle hill where the prairie grass grew knee-high and whispered secrets to the wind. The sun had set completely now, and the stars were coming out in numbers that still surprised me after 2 years under European skies. The silo rose from the hilltop like a monument to abandoned dreams. 40 feet tall, maybe 25 feet across all metal that had once been silver but had weathered to a rust-colored brown. The roof sat crooked and the door hung on one hinge, but the structure itself looked sound. Solid bones even if the flesh had rotted. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness. The interior smelled of rust and old grain and bird nests. Debris covered the floor, broken boards and torn burlap sacks in the accumulated dust of a decade's neglect. But I didn't see ruin. I saw possibility. I'd learned something in the trenches of France in the long hours between battles when we'd reinforce our positions or dig new ones. I'd learned that the best protection wasn't thick concrete or steel beams. It was earth itself, dirt and clay packed tight, absorbing the shock of artillery that would shatter anything rigid. I'd also learned something from an old French farmer who'd given me shelter one night when I'd gotten separated from my unit. His house was built of clay and straw walls, 2 feet thick, and it stayed cool in summer and warm in winter without any stove at all. He'd explained it to me in broken English, how the thermal mass worked, how the round shape of his home let the wind slide past instead of pushing against flat surfaces. I placed my hand against the metal wall of the silo. It was still warm from the day's sun, and I could feel the heat radiating through. In winter, this would be the opposite, ice cold, stealing warmth from anything inside. But if I insulated it, if I covered the metal with clay and straw, built thick walls on the inside, if I made it round instead of square, natural instead of manufactured, a sound from the darkness made me turn. A low growl, threat and warning combined. My hand went automatically to my belt, where my trench knife would have been if the army hadn't taken it when they mustered me out. 2 eyes reflected in the moonlight coming through the door. A dog, large and lean, with fur the color of smoke and ashes. Its ribs showed through its coat, and there was something else. A leather collar, frayed and broken. Military issue. War dog, I said quietly. Left behind, same as me. The dog didn't move closer, but the growl faded. We looked at each other across the space, 2 soldiers, too damaged to go home, too stubborn to die. I reached into my duffel and pulled out a piece of salt pork I'd been saving, tossed it onto the floor between us. Your choice. Stay or go. I won't force you either way. The dog watched me for a long moment, then crept forward, snatched the meat, and retreated to the far wall. It lay down there, eyes never leaving me. I spread my blanket on the clearest patch of floor and laid down my back against my duffel. The metal walls above me were visible through gaps in the darkness, curved and strong, despite their rust. Tomorrow I'd start building, not because I had to, but because for the first time since France I had something I wanted to prove. Not to the town, not to my father, but to myself. That night I dreamed of trenches and artillery, But when I woke before dawn, the dog was still there. Closer now, close enough that I could hear it breathing. I named him Ash for the color of his fur and for the way we'd both risen from the ashes of a war that tried to burn us away. The first week I worked alone. I cleaned the silo from top to bottom, hauling out debris until my back ached and my hands blistered. The dog, Ash, watched from various positions around the structure, never quite trusting, but never leaving either. On the third day I found the clay. There was a creek that ran past the base of the hill, and the bank there was rich with it. Gray-blue clay that stuck to my hands and held its shape when I squeezed it. I knew clay. My grandfather had built a root cellar with it when I was a boy, and I remembered watching him work his hands moving with the kind of patience that comes from understanding materials at a fundamental level. I gathered straw from an abandoned field where the farmer had died in the influenza epidemic that swept through in 1917. The crop had grown and deadened and dried where it stood golden and perfect for what I needed, and I began to build. The mixture was simple: 3 parts clay to 1 part straw, enough water to make it workable but not soupy. I mixed it in an old barrel I found behind the saloon, my hands kneading the earth and plant fiber together until they became something new, something stronger than either component alone. Then I began spreading it on the interior walls of the silo, starting at the bottom, working my way up in sections. Each handful pressed firmly against the metal filling gaps, creating a layer that would eventually be 2 feet thick. People from town came to watch. They sat on their horses at the base of the hill, pointing and laughing. I could hear their voices carrying on the wind. Crazy soldier boy building a mud hut. Give it a month. First rain will wash it all away. Someone should tell him he's wasting his time. But no one told me anything. They just watched and laughed and rode away. Except for one person. On the 4th day, an old man appeared at the top of the hill. He didn't ride a horse or make a show of himself. He just walked up quietly and stood watching me work. He was maybe 70 years old, thin as a rail, with eyes that had the kind of sharpness that comes from a lifetime of actually seeing things instead of just looking at them. I kept working, spreading clay, smoothing it with my palms. After an hour, he spoke. "You know what you're doing?" "I think so." "You think or you know?" I stopped, looked at him. "I know the theory. I'm learning the practice." He smiled just a little. "That's an honest answer. Most young men would have lied, said they knew it all." He stepped closer, touched the wall I'd been working on. Clay and straw. Old technique. Older than this country. Older than most countries. My grandfather used it. Smart man, your grandfather. He studied my work with the kind of attention that felt like an examination. "The ratio's good. The application's decent. But you're going to have problems with the cure if you don't slow down." "What do you mean clay shrinks when it dries?" "If you put it on too thick all at once, it'll crack. You need to do it in layers. Thin layers. Let each one cure before you add the next. It'll take longer, but it'll last." I looked at the wall at the work I'd already done. He was right. I could see where the thicker sections were already showing hairline cracks. "Who are you?" "Named Silas Crow. Used to be a railroad engineer. Built bridges, tunnel stations. Retired 5 years back after the company decided I was too old to be useful." He said it without bitterness, just fact. "I live down by the creek. Saw you working up here. Thought you might want some help." "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Don't need to know you. I know what you're trying to do. And I've been waiting a long time for someone in this town to understand that nature's smarter than we are. That round is stronger than square. That earth is better than wood." He held out his hand. "So, you want help, or you want to keep making mistakes until you figure it out on your own?" I shook his hand. His grip was strong, the calluses of a lifetime of real work. "I'd appreciate the help, sir." "Don't call me sir. Call me Silas. And tomorrow we'll start building a stove. Because that clay wall isn't going to mean much if you freeze to death come winter." He left as quietly as he'd come, and I stood there watching him descend the hill with steady, measured steps. Ash came and sat beside me the first time he'd come that close without food as a bribe. "We got ourselves a teacher boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. He leaned into my hand, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Something that had been tight since France. That night I sat by a small fire outside the silo and wrote in the notebook I'd kept since the war. The Army had encouraged us to write, said it helped with the transition home. Most men wrote about their feelings. I wrote about engineering problems and solutions. August 3rd, 1918. Met Silas Crow today, former railroad engineer. He understands what I'm trying to do. He sees it. Tomorrow we start the stove. Thermal mass design, he says. Stone that holds heat long after the fire dies. I've seen the concept in manuals but never built one. Ash is finally trusting me. Small steps. The town still thinks I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But crazy or not, I'm going to prove that this works. Not for them, for me. Because I'm tired of being told what I can't do. Tired of being told I owe something I didn't agree to give. Tired of being looked at like I'm broken because I survived. This silo is going to be more than shelter. It's going to be proof. I closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. Somewhere in Kansas, my father was probably lying in the same farmhouse where I'd grown up, staring at the same ceiling I'd stared at as a boy. I wondered if he was thinking about me, if he regretted what he'd said. I wondered if I'd ever stop caring whether he did. The answer I suspected would come with time. Everything did if you were patient enough to wait for it. And if there was one thing the war had taught me, it was patience. The patience to endure. The patience to survive. The patience to build something worth building no matter how long it took. Tomorrow I'd start building the stove. And the day after that I'd continue the walls. And the day after that, and the day after that, until the work was done or winter killed me. Either way, I wouldn't quit. Quitting wasn't in me anymore. The war had burned that possibility away. Silas arrived at dawn carrying tools I didn't own and knowledge I desperately needed. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who'd spent decades making things that had to last, setting down a canvas bag filled with chisels and levels and measuring devices that looked older than the town itself. First rule of building a thermal mass stove, he said, not bothering with good morning or small talk. Location matters more than construction. You put it in the wrong spot, doesn't matter how well you build it, it won't work. We spent that first morning just planning. Silas walked the interior of the silo in slow circles, occasionally stopping to knock on the wall or look up at the way light fell through the crooked roof. Ash followed him like he was evaluating whether this old man was worth trusting. Center, Silas finally declared, pointing to a spot equidistant from all walls. Heat radiates in a circle. You put it in the center of a round room, every part of the wall gets equal warmth. Put it against the wall like most folks, do you waste half your heat pushing it outside? We walked to the creek together, Silas teaching me to identify the right kind of stone. Not sandstone, which would crack under heat. Not limestone, which would crumble. Granite, if we could find it. And river stones worn smooth by current, dense and heavy. Each stone has to be earned, he said, hefting a perfect specimen the size of a man's head. Light ones are porous. They'll explode when they heat up, send shrapnel across the room. Heavy ones are solid all the way through. They'll hold heat for hours after the fire dies. We spent 3 days collecting stones. My back screamed protest, the shrapnel near my spine sending lightning bolts down my leg every time I bent. But I didn't complain. Complaining was for men who had the luxury of someone who cared enough to listen. The construction itself was mathematics made physical. Silas had me lay out the base, first a perfect circle 4 feet across. Then we began stacking each stone chosen for how it fit with its neighbor's gaps filled with the clay mixture I'd learned to make. The fire chamber has to be exactly the right size. Silas explained, his hands guiding mine as we set stones. Too small, you can't get enough heat. Too large, you waste wood. 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, 18 inches tall. That's the mathematics of efficiency. But the real genius was in the chimney. Instead of running straight up and out like conventional stoves, Silas had me build a pipe that curved along the interior wall of the silo, making a long journey before finally exiting through the roof. Every foot that smoke travels inside this building is a foot where heat transfers to your clay walls, he said. By the time the smoke leaves, it should be barely warm. All that heat stays here where you need it. We worked from sunrise to sunset for 3 weeks. My hands, already calloused from labor, developed new layers of toughness. Ash learned to stay clear when we were moving heavy stones, but would sit and watch during the detailed work, his head tilted like he was trying to understand the logic of what we were building. The men from town rode up occasionally, Jack Murphy among them. They'd watch for a while, make their comments loud enough for us to hear. Still at it, I see. When's the grand collapse? I got money on October. My pa says that stove will burn the whole thing down. Crazy way to build. Silas would glance at them, then return to work without comment. But one afternoon after they'd been particularly crude, he set down his tools and looked at me. You know why they mock you? Because I'm different. No, because you scare them. He pointed toward town with a clay-covered hand. Every man down there built their life on what their fathers taught them. Square houses, wood stoves, the same way it's been done for 100 years. You come along and say there's a better way. That terrifies them. Because if you're right, it means they might be wrong. And a man's got to be pretty secure to admit he might be wrong. What if I am wrong? Then you'll freeze to death come winter, and they'll feel vindicated for about a week before they forget you ever existed. He smiled, that slight upturn of lips that I was learning meant he was about to say something important. But if you're right, Eli, if this works, you'll change how people think about building in this part of the world. And that's worth the risk. The stove was completed on September 8th. We built the fire slowly, carefully watching for any sign of structural failure. The smoke drew beautifully up through the curved pipe, and within an hour I could feel the clay walls beginning to warm. By evening, the temperature inside the silo had risen to 70 degrees while the outside air had dropped to 50. The stones glowed with retained heat, and the clay walls radiated warmth like they were alive. Silas placed his palm against the wall, held it there, then nodded with satisfaction. You did it, son. You built something that'll outlast both of us. The emotion that hit me was unexpected and overwhelming. I'd built things in France, defensive positions and reinforced bunkers, but those were built to facilitate death. This was built for life, for survival, for the simple human need to be warm when the world turned cold. Thank you, I managed, for teaching me. Don't thank me yet. Winter in Nebraska isn't kind to amateurs. But his eyes were warm when he said it. Now let's talk about food storage, because staying warm won't matter much if you starve. That evening, Ash stretched out beside the stove and released a sound I'd never heard from him before. A sigh of pure contentment. I sat against the curved wall, feeling the warmth seep into my back, easing the constant ache where the shrapnel lived. For the first time since returning from France, I felt something close to peace. The feeling lasted exactly 6 days. Sheriff Whitmore rode up the hill on a gray morning, his horse moving carefully to accommodate the rider's missing leg. He carried an envelope in his hand, and his face told me the news wouldn't be good before he even dismounted. Letter came for you, he said, passing it down, from Kansas. My father's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere, that precise script he'd learned in a one-room schoolhouse 70 years prior. I almost didn't open it, almost told Whitmore to burn it and save us both the trouble. But I opened it. The words were brief, absent of emotion or pleading. Just facts delivered like a military report. Eli, your father made a mistake. The farm is lost. The bank will take possession October 15th. If you return and agree to work it, the debt could be restructured. Morrison still wants to buy into the family. Partnership with his son would save everything. Your father asked nothing for himself, only that you consider the land that fed you, the land that made you. Come home. Thomas Brennan. My hands were shaking. I realized I'd stopped breathing and forced air into my lungs. Bad news, Whitmore asked, though he clearly already knew. My father's losing his farm, and he wants you to come save it. He wants me to sell myself to save it. I crumpled the letter. Marry into the Morrison family. Spend my life farming land I never wanted to farm in the first place. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. You could save him, Eli. By destroying myself. Maybe, or maybe by being the bigger man. I looked at him, this sheriff who'd lost a leg in France and come home to a town that didn't understand what that cost. Did you go back to who you were before the war? No, couldn't. That man died in Belleau Wood, same place as my leg. Then you understand. I can't go back either. The man my father wants me to be, he died in Argonne Forest. I'm someone different now. And this? I gestured at the silo, at the walls I'd built at the stove, still radiating yesterday's heat. This is who I am now. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then you'd better finish what you started, because winter's coming and it doesn't care about our decisions. He rode away and I stood there holding my father's crumpled letter. Part of me wanted to ride to Kansas, to save the farm, to be the son he needed even if it meant burying the man I'd become. But I couldn't. The war had taken too much already. I wouldn't let it take this too. I walked to the stove, lifted the iron door, and fed the letter to the flames. Watched my father's words curl and blacken and turn to ash. Ash the dog looked up at me, and I could swear I saw understanding in his eyes. "We don't go backward," I told him, "only forward." He laid his head back down, and I returned to work. September became October, and the air began to change. Silas came less frequently, now his joints bothering him in the cooling weather. But he'd taught me enough that I could continue alone. The clay walls were nearly complete, 2 feet thick on all sides, and the interior of the silo had transformed from an industrial shell into something that felt almost alive. I'd built shelves directly into the clay, shaping them while the material was still wet. A bed frame in the curve of the wall, a small table near the stove, everything organic, flowing part of the structure itself rather than furniture placed inside it. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. More people came to watch now, though their mockery had evolved into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. One afternoon, Annie Fletcher appeared at the entrance. She was 17, the blacksmith's daughter, thin as a reed with eyes too large for her face. I knew her slightly. She'd been one of the first in town to catch the Spanish flu that swept through in late summer. "Mr. Brennan," she said, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "I brought you something." She held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were candles, a dozen of them, hand-dipped and smelling of beeswax. "You helped me," she said quietly, "when I was sick. You brought food to our house when no one else would come near. Papa wanted you to have these." I remembered those weeks. Doc Hayes had quarantined half the town, and people were terrified. The flu had killed millions worldwide, and in a place as small as Redemption Creek, one infected person could doom everyone. But I'd survived trenches filled with disease and death. A virus didn't scare me the way it scared people who'd never seen real pestilence. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I know, but Papa says a debt of kindness should be repaid with kindness. And he thinks," she hesitated, "he thinks what you're doing here is good, even if others don't see it yet." After she left, I set the candles on a shelf and felt that loosening in my chest again. The knowledge that not everyone in Redemption Creek had written me off as crazy. It was a small comfort, but small comforts matter when you're building a life from nothing. The first frost came on October 20th. I woke to find the world transformed, every blade of grass crystalline and beautiful in the early light. Inside the silo, with just the residual heat from the previous night's fire, the temperature was still comfortable. 58 degrees while outside measured 32. Silas had been right. The thermal mass worked. I was checking the seal around the door when Silas himself appeared, moving slower than usual. His face had a gray cast to it that worried me. "You all right, old man?" Don't call me old, makes me feel my age. But he was breathing harder than the walk up the hill should have required. "Came to warn you, weather's changing, bad changing. First frost is normal for October." Not talking about frost. He looked north toward the distant horizon where the prairie met the sky. Geese flew south 3 weeks early. Squirrels are burying nuts twice as deep as usual. Oak trees drop their leaves in September instead of November. You know what that means? I did. My grandfather had taught me to read nature's signs, though I'd half forgotten in the years since. Hard winter coming. Not just hard, catastrophic. Silas's voice was grim. "I've lived in Nebraska for 60 years. I know these signs. There's a blizzard building somewhere north of here, and when it comes, it's going to try to kill everything in its path. When? Can't say exactly, but soon, before Thanksgiving, I'd wager, maybe sooner." He turned to look at the silo, at the work we'd done together. "You need to finish this, all of it, and you need to stock supplies like you're preparing for a siege. The town should know. The town won't listen. Not to me. I'm just a crazy old engineer who talks to trees. But you could try telling the sheriff." I did try. That afternoon, I walked into Redemption Creek and found Whitmore in his office. Told him everything Silas had said. The signs, the warnings, the severity of what was coming. Whitmore listened, nodding thoughtfully. "I believe you, Eli, and I believe Silas. But the town council won't. They think he's half senile. But if he's right, people could die. I know, I'll warn them. I'll tell them to prepare, but I can't force them to listen. He stood, grabbed his crutch. But I'll make sure my own house is ready, and I suggest you do the same. The warning went out, but it was received exactly as Whitmore predicted. The town council posted a notice recommending citizens stock extra firewood and food, but framed it as routine winter preparation. Most people ignored it. Jack Murphy made sure to ride past my hill the next day shouting loud enough for half the prairie to hear. Hey, Brennan Silas got you believing the end times are coming. You and the crazy old man can huddle in your tin can and wait for the apocalypse. His friends laughed, but I noticed Jack's laugh sounded forced, hollow, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I returned to work with renewed urgency, cut and stacked wood until I had a pile 8 feet high and 12 feet long, bought supplies from the general store, paying with money I'd saved from my army pay, beans, flour, salt pork, sugar, lamp oil, everything that would keep. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Hartwell, looked at my purchases with barely concealed disdain. Planning to hide from society all winter, Mr. Brennan. Planning to survive it, ma'am. Survival isn't the same as living. No, ma'am, but you can't do the second without the first. Well, she wrapped my goods in brown paper with sharp, angry movements. I paid and left wondering what I'd done to earn her particular brand of contempt. But I was learning that some people need someone to look down on. It makes their own choices feel more valid. November arrived with unseasonable warmth. Indian summer stretching golden across the prairie. The town relaxed. Sea people said Silas was wrong. Just a confused old man seeing patterns that weren't there. But Silas wasn't wrong. On November 5th, he came to see me one last time. He looked terrible. Whatever illness had been building in him had progressed to the point where even walking was clearly painful. He sat heavily on a log I'd set up outside the silo, breathing like each inhalation cost him something precious. Silas, you need to see Doc Hayes. Seen him, nothing to be done, heart's giving out, been giving out for a while now. He waved away my concern. Not here to talk about that. Here to tell you the storm's coming. Soon. Maybe 2 weeks. When it does, you stay inside. Don't open that door for anything until it's over. You hear me? I hear you. And Eli, he gripped my arm with surprising strength. What we built here, it's good work. The best work I've done in 40 years. You understand, not the biggest, not the most impressive, but the most true. We built according to nature's rules, not man's ego. That matters. You taught me well. I taught you what I knew. What you do with it, that's on you. He released my arm, stood with effort. There's a journal in my cabin. Technical drawings, calculations, methods I've learned. It's yours now. Use it. Build more of these. Teach others. Don't let the knowledge die with me. You're not dying. We're all dying, son. Some of us just know our schedule. He smiled that slight smile one last time. You're going to be fine. Better than fine. You're going to show this whole damn town that there's wisdom in circles and strength in humility. He walked away, and I watched him descend the hill with a certainty in my gut that I'd never see him alive again. 3 days later, Sheriff Whitmore brought the news. Silas Crow had died in his sleep peacefully, with a half-finished drawing of a bridge on the table beside his bed. The funeral was small. Whitmore, Doc Hayes Fletcher, the blacksmith, Annie, and me. We buried him on a hill overlooking the creek where he could see the water that had given him the stones we'd built with. I tried to speak to say something worthy of the man who'd given me more than my own father ever had. But words failed. Instead, I read from his journal a passage he'd written years before. The engineer's greatest achievement is not in building monuments to human ambition, but in creating structures that honor the laws that govern all things. Gravity thermodynamics, the properties of materials under stress. These are not obstacles to overcome, but truths to embrace. The bridge that fights the river will fall. The one that works with it will stand for generations. We covered him with prairie earth, and I placed a river stone on top of the grave. The same kind we'd use for the stove. Heavy, dense, permanent. That night I sat in the silo and read through Silas's journal by lamplight. Page after page of calculations, drawings, observations about the natural world and how to build in harmony with it. The last entry was dated the day before he died. Taught Eli Brennan everything I know about thermal mass construction. He understands it better than I dared hope. If the winter is as bad as I fear, his silo may be the only shelter that survives. I won't live to see it, but that's all right. A teacher's legacy isn't in living to see the results. It's in knowing the student will carry forward the work, and Eli will. Of that, I'm certain. I closed the journal and looked around at the walls we'd built together. The stove that would keep me warm. The thick clay insulation that would protect me from whatever winter brought. I'll make you proud, I said to the empty room, to the ghost of a teacher who'd seen something in me worth nurturing. I promise. Outside, the wind had begun to change. The warm spell was breaking. The air smelled different now. Metallic. Sharp. Like the atmosphere before an artillery barrage when even the insects go silent because something terrible is gathering strength. Ash raised his head, ears pointed north. He whined low and anxious. I checked my supplies one more time. Wood stacked and dry. Food organized and inventoried. The stove cleaned and ready. The door sealed and reinforced. Everything was as prepared as I could make it. All that remained was to wait. And on the prairie in November of 1918, with the world still reeling from a war that had killed millions and a pandemic that had killed millions more, waiting was the hardest work of all. The sky changed on November 26th. I woke to a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. No birds, no wind rustling through the dry prairie grass, just an oppressive stillness that pressed down on everything like a physical weight. I stepped outside the silo into air that felt wrong, too heavy, too still. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the sky was a uniform gray cloud so low and thick they seemed to touch the tops of the hills. Ash stood beside me, hackles raised, staring north. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, the same sound he'd made in France when artillery was incoming. He knew. Animals always know. I spent that morning doing final checks, sealed the last gaps around the door with clay, brought in extra wood and stacked it against the interior wall, filled every container I owned in with water from the creek, knowing that once the storm hit, leaving the silo would be suicide. By noon, the first snowflakes began to fall, lazy, almost gentle, drifting down like they had all the time in the world. Within an hour, they'd multiplied into a steady curtain. By 2 o'clock, the wind arrived. It didn't build gradually. It exploded. One moment, relative calm. The next, a howling beast that slammed into the prairie with violence that made the silo's metal walls sing. The sound was like nothing I'd heard, and I'd heard German artillery that could liquefy a man's organs from concussive force alone. I stood at the small window I'd installed, watching the world disappear. The town of Redemption Creek, visible from my hilltop perch, vanished behind walls of white. The wind didn't blow snow horizontally. It created a chaos of movement, where directions ceased to have meaning, where up and down and sideways were all the same swirling void. Inside the silo, the temperature held steady. 70 degrees. The clay walls absorbed the wind's fury, and the curved surface gave it nothing to grip. I could hear the metal exterior groaning, feel the faint vibration through the floor, but the structure held firm. I built up the fire in the stove, feeding it carefully. Not too much, which would waste wood I might need if this lasted longer than expected. Just enough to maintain the heat that the clay would store and radiate back through the long hours ahead. Ash settled beside the stove, his usual position, but his ears remained up, tracking sounds I couldn't hear beneath the wind's roar. Hours passed. Daylight faded into a darkness absolute and complete. I lit a single candle, one of Annie's gifts, and the small flame seemed almost defiant in its fragility. Then came the pounding on the door. At first I thought it was debris, something thrown by the wind. But it came again, rhythmic and desperate. Someone was out there. Ash was on his feet, instantly barking. I grabbed the wooden bar that secured the door and hesitated. Opening it meant letting in the storm, letting in cold that could kill the warmth I'd so carefully maintained. But leaving someone outside meant condemning them to certain death. I'd made a promise to myself after France. No more death if I could prevent it. I lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The wind hit me like a fist, nearly knocking me backward. Snow and ice screamed into the silo, and two figures stumbled through the opening, more falling than walking. I slammed the door shut, threw the bar back in place, and turned to see who I'd saved. Sheriff Whitmore lay on the floor, breathing in great gasping heaves. Beside him, shaking so violently her teeth chattered like castanets, was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. The woman who'd looked at me with such contempt in her store. Now she looked small and terrified. Her expensive coat crusted with ice, her face nearly blue. I didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just pointed toward the stove and helped Whitmore drag himself closer to the heat. Mrs. Hartwell followed, moving like someone in shock. They sat there for long minutes, just breathing and shaking, and slowly returning to something resembling human. Finally, Whitmore looked up at me. "The roofs are gone," he said, his voice raw. "Wind just tore them off. Mrs. Hartwell's store, the saloon, half the houses. We saw your light from town, the only light still burning." Before I could respond, the pounding came again. This time it was Fletcher the blacksmith, his wife, and Annie. They fell through the door in a heap, and I had to put my full weight against the wood to close it again. The wind was getting stronger. Then came more. The owner of the boarding house and his family, the town clerk, an elderly widow whose name I didn't know. Each group arrived half-frozen, desperate, terrified. Each time I opened the door, more of the storm's fury invaded my sanctuary, but each time I closed it, the clay walls absorbed the cold, and the stove's heat pushed back. By midnight, 28 people crowded the interior of the silo. 28 souls who'd mocked me, dismissed me, called me crazy. Now they huddled in the space I'd built on the floor I'd prepared, warmed by the stove Silas had taught me to construct. The last to arrive was Jack Murphy and his father. Jack stood in the doorway, his face a mask of frost and humiliation. Behind him, his father looked a decade older than he had that morning. Jack's lips moved, but I couldn't hear him over the wind. He tried again. "Brennan, I have nowhere else to go." I looked at him for a long moment, remembered him shoving me, remembered his mocking laughter, remembered every cruel word. The old me, the one who'd left for France, full of anger and pride, would have slammed the door in his face. But that man had died in the trenches. The one who came back understood something different. Understood that survival wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about being alive. And being alive meant choosing life even for people who didn't deserve your mercy. I stepped aside. Jack and his father stumbled in, and I closed the door for what I hoped would be the last time that night. 31 people now. 31 human beings pressed together in a space designed for one. The silo that the town had ridiculed was now the only thing standing between them and frozen death. Nobody spoke. They just sat or lay on the floor, wrapped in whatever coverings they'd managed to grab, listening to the storm scream its fury outside, while inside the clay walls held firm and the stove radiated heat that felt like hope made tangible. I moved among them, checking for frostbite, distributing blankets I'd made from old burlap sacks. When I reached Mrs. Hartwell, she grabbed my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for how I treated you." "Later," I said. "Right now, just stay warm." I cooked. It was the only useful thing I could do. I had a large pot one I'd found abandoned behind the general store, and I filled it with beans and water and salt pork and set it over the stove. The smell of cooking food filled the space, and I saw people's faces change. Saw fear recede slightly in the face of this most basic comfort. When it was ready, I served it in the few bowls I had, passing them around. People shared, taking small amounts and passing the bowl on. No one complained about the portions. No one demanded more. Survival has a way of stripping away entitlement. Fletcher found me as I was refilling the pot. "Brennan, you saved our lives. The silo saved your lives. I just built it." "Why?" His voice was raw with emotion. "After how we treated you, why did you let us in?" I thought about that. About the real answer, which was complicated and bound up in too many memories of men dying in my arms while I could do nothing but watch. About the simpler answer, which was maybe more true. Because I've seen enough people die. The first night lasted forever. The storm outside maintained its violence without pause. Wind speeds that I estimated at 60 or 70 miles per hour. Snow fell at rates that would have been impressive in a normal blizzard. This was something else entirely. This was nature reminding humanity exactly how small and fragile it really was. Inside the silo, body heat from 31 people combined with the stove's thermal mass to keep the temperature steady. It never dropped below 68 degrees. I monitored it obsessively, adjusting the fire, checking the walls for any sign of failure. They held. Silas had built true. The second day brought new challenges. Food was running lower than I'd anticipated. I'd prepared for one person for 2 months, not 31 people for however long this would last. I cut the rations, making the soup thinner, stretching every bean and scrap of pork as far as it would go. No one complained. Hunger was better than freezing. It was on the second night that the child got sick. The blacksmith's son, a boy of 8, named Ben. He woke screaming, thrashing, burning with fever. His mother held him, trying to quiet the screams, but the fever had him in its grip. Doc Hayes wasn't among the survivors. He'd stayed in his office treating a patient, and the roof had collapsed before he could escape. Whitmore had seen it happen, seen the old doctor disappear under timber and snow, and there'd been nothing anyone could do. So it fell to me. I knew field medicine, what every soldier learned. How to treat wounds, set bones, manage shock. But fever in a child was different. I made him as comfortable as I could, used snow from outside the door to bring his temperature down, forced water between his lips. Drop by drop, Annie sat with me through the night, helping hold the boy still during the worst of the convulsions. Her hands were steady, her voice soft. "You're good at this," she said during a quiet moment. "I've had practice. Too much practice. In the war. Yes. Do you ever wish you hadn't gone? I thought about that. Every day. But wishing doesn't change what was. It only poisons what is." Ben's fever broke near dawn of the third day. He slept peacefully for the first time in 12 hours, and his mother wept against my shoulder in relief and gratitude. I felt Whitmore's eyes on me from across the room and met his gaze. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. "You did well." The storm raged for 4 days total. 4 days where the world outside became an alien landscape of snow and wind and cold that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. 4 days where 31 people lived in a space barely large enough for 10 sharing food and water and body heat and fear. And in those 4 days, something changed. Jack Murphy, who'd mocked me and shoved me and called me a coward, spent hours helping me maintain the fire. He learned to read the stove's temperature by the color of the metal, learned to feed it just enough wood to sustain without wasting. We didn't speak much, but we worked side by side, and that said more than words could. Mrs. Hartwell, who treated me like filth, organized the food distribution with ruthless efficiency. She made sure the children ate first, then the elderly, then everyone else. She took the smallest portions for herself and never mentioned it. Murphy Sr., the saloon owner who'd refused me work, taught his son and the other young men songs from his childhood. Bawdy drinking songs, mostly, but they made people laugh, and laughter in the face of death is its own kind of defiance. People talked, shared stories of their lives, their fears, their regrets. In the enforced intimacy of survival, the social masks fell away. Rich and poor respected and scorned, all of it became irrelevant. We were just humans huddled together against the void. On the third night, when the storm was at its worst and the walls shook with the force of wind that sounded like demons screaming, Whitmore stood up. He was unsteady on his one leg, had to brace himself against the curved wall, but his voice carried clear and strong. "I need to say something. We all need to say something." He looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight. "We were wrong about Eli, about this place. We laughed at him, called him crazy, treated him like he was broken because he came back from the war, different than he left." He paused, gathering himself. But he wasn't broken. We were. Broken in our thinking, broken in our pride, broken in our certainty that our way was the only way. Mrs. Hartwell stood next, her voice shaking. "I was cruel to you, Eli. I judged you for being different, for not fitting into what I thought a young man should be. I'm sorry. Truly sorry." One by one they stood. They apologized. They acknowledged their mockery, their cruelty, their blindness. And one by one I told them it was all right, that I understood, that survival erases debts. But when Jack Murphy stood, when he made his way across the crowded floor and dropped to his knees in front of me, that was different. "I don't deserve to be here," he said, and his voice broke. "I pushed you. I insulted you. I made your life hell because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I didn't go to war, that my father bought my way out, that I was safe while you and the sheriff and all the others were dying in France." Tears ran down his face, and he didn't wipe them away. "I hated you because you were everything I wasn't. Brave, skilled, honorable. And when you built this place, when you proved that you understood things, I couldn't even imagine I hated you more. Because it meant I wasn't just a coward. I was a fool. He looked up at me and I saw genuine anguish in his eyes. Why did you save me after everything I did? Why did you open that door? The whole silo had gone silent, everyone waiting for my answer. I thought about all the men I'd watched die in France. Good men, better men than me. Men who'd never come home, never have the chance to build anything or love anyone or make up for their mistakes. I thought about the randomness of survival, how I'd lived when so many hadn't, and how that randomness didn't care about deserving. Because I'm tired of death, I said simply. I've seen too much of it, caused too much of it. And if I have the power to choose life even for someone who's hurt me, then that's what I'll choose, every time. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to prove to myself that survival can mean more than just staying alive. Jack nodded, understanding, flowing between us. He stood, held out his hand. I shook it. And in that gesture, something fundamental shifted. We weren't friends, might never be, but we were both human, both flawed, both trying to be better than our worst moments. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute, it woke me from shallow sleep. I went to the door, listened. Nothing. No howling. No rattling of metal. Just profound, crystalline quiet. I opened the door slowly, carefully. The light that flooded in was blinding sun reflecting off snow that had transformed the entire world. Drifts rose 15 feet high in places. The town of Redemption Creek was buried, only the tops of a few buildings visible above the white expanse. But the silo stood untouched. Snow had slid off its curved surface, piling around the base but leaving the structure itself clean and whole. The round design the shape Silas had insisted on had let the wind and snow flow past instead of accumulating. People filed out slowly, blinking in the brightness, shocked into silence by the magnitude of the destruction. Everything they'd known, every building they'd trusted lay in ruins beneath the snow. But they were alive. 31 people who should have been corpses were standing in the morning sun, breathing cold air that tasted like rebirth. They turned as one to look at the silo, at this round metal structure covered in clay, this thing they'd ridiculed and dismissed, the thing that had saved their lives. Fletcher spoke first, his voice full of wonder. It's perfect, the design, the shape, everything. It worked exactly as it should. Murphy Sr. nodded slowly. We build everything square, fighting nature instead of working with it. But this, he placed his hand on the curved wall, this listens to nature, learns from it. Jack looked at me, his eyes serious. Teach me, teach us. We have to rebuild the town. But this time we build it right. We build it your way. I wanted to correct him, to say it wasn't my way, it was Silas's way, nature's way, but the words caught in my throat, because Silas was gone. And if his knowledge was going to serve him, if his wisdom about building in harmony with the world instead of in opposition to it was going to spread, then it would have to be through me. All right, I said, we'll rebuild together, but first we need to survive the winter. There are supplies in the silo. We'll ration them out. Everyone gets a share, and we start planning for spring. The work began immediately. We dug out paths through the snow, found survivors trapped in partially collapsed buildings, and brought them to the silo. By the end of the first week after the storm, we'd rescued 17 more people. 48 souls total, all sustained by a structure built by hands they'd once mocked. The rebuilding took months. But when spring finally came, Redemption Creek rose again. Different this time. The first new building was a community hall, round and thick-walled, built exactly according to Silas's principles. Then homes also round or half-round, all designed to work with the wind instead of fighting it. Jack Murphy became my best student. He learned the mathematics of thermal mass, the properties of clay and stone, the wisdom of curves over corners. He was tireless, dedicated, as if he could atone for his earlier cruelty through the purity of his commitment to learning. Annie Fletcher helped draw the plans, her artist's eye translating my engineering knowledge into beautiful designs that made the technical accessible to everyone. And slowly, reluctantly, I became part of the community I'd never wanted to join. But the silo remained mine. I lived there through that winter and into spring and beyond. It was home in a way no structure had been since childhood. Every wall held memory, every curve told a story. Silas's lessons, the storm's fury, The moment when strangers became neighbors because survival demanded it. One evening in early spring, as I sat outside watching the sunset paint the prairie in impossible colors, Whitmore rode up the hill. He moved better, now had gotten a better prosthetic leg, but still took his time dismounting. "Letter came for you," he said, handing me an envelope. Kansas postmark, but not my father's handwriting. I opened it and read, my throat tightening with each word. "Mr. Brennan, regret to inform you that Thomas Brennan passed away on March 3rd, 1920. His heart failed. It was quick. He left instructions that you should know he died thinking of you. He wanted you to know he was proud, that he understood too late that a man should be allowed to choose his own path. He wished he had had the courage to tell you himself. There was no money, no property, but there was this letter which he wrote shortly before his death but never sent. He asked that it be delivered after he passed. Respectfully, Constance, Warren County Administrator." The second envelope was thin, the paper cheap. My father's handwriting shakier than I remembered. The message was brief. "Eli, I was wrong. I chose land over love, tradition over understanding. I lost everything, anyway. The farm, my pride, my son. But I want you to know that I heard about the storm, about what you built, about how you saved the town that rejected you. And I understood then what I should have understood when you came home from France. You don't owe the world what it expects. You owe it what you're capable of giving. I'm proud of you, son. I should have said it when it mattered. I'm sorry I waited until it was too late. Your father." I sat there holding the letter until the sun went down and stars emerged like pinpricks in a vast dark curtain. Whitmore sat with me saying nothing, just being present in the way good men do when words would only diminish the moment. Finally, I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. He died thinking I hated him. Maybe. Or maybe he died knowing he had raised a son strong enough to forge his own path. That's not nothing, Eli. It should have been more. Should have is the saddest phrase in any language. Whitmore stood gripped my shoulder. But what you did here, what you're still doing, building this town into something that works with nature instead of against it, that's a legacy that matters. Silas would be proud, and I think despite everything your father was proud too. He just didn't know how to say it until it was too late. After Whitmore left, I sat alone with Ash, who'd grown grayer in the muzzle but no less loyal. We looked out over Redemption Creek, where lights were beginning to glow in round windows of round buildings, where smoke rose from chimneys designed to use heat efficiently instead of wasting it. The town that had rejected me had become something new, something better. And I'd been part of that transformation, not through anger or revenge, but through the simple act of building something true. "We did it, old friend," I said to Ash. "We survived." He leaned against my legs, solid and warm, and I scratched behind his ears the way he liked. Tomorrow there would be more work, more building, more teaching. But tonight there was just this: peace, purpose, the knowledge that survival is only the beginning. What you do after, that's what defines whether you merely lived or actually mattered. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that shone over France, over Kansas, over every battlefield and farm and town where men struggled to find meaning in the chaos. And here on a hill in Nebraska, in a round tower covered in clay, I'd found my answer, not in fighting against the world, but in learning to build with it. Not in demanding respect, but in earning it through work that spoke louder than words ever could. Not in holding grudges, but in choosing again and again to save lives instead of taking them. The war had tried to destroy me. My father's rejection had tried to break me. The town's mockery had tried to shame me. But I'd endured. Not because I was special, but because I'd learned the simplest and most profound lesson that Silas ever taught me. The circle is the shape of life. It has no beginning and no end. It simply continues bending when it must, holding when it can, always returning to itself. And if a man can learn to live like that, to bend without breaking, to hold without rigidity, to keep moving forward in an endless loop of growth and learning and building, then he'll survive anything the world throws at him. I stood Ash rising with me and walked back into the silo. My home, my fortress, my testament to the idea that different isn't wrong, it's just different. And sometimes different is exactly what the world needs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I was warm, I was alive, and I was finally at peace. That was enough, More than enough. It was everything.